Hi, everyone. I'm Jake Novak, and this is the latest edition of the Analysts with Jake Novak. And of course, this is the show where we dispassionately as possible, we try to be as smart as we possibly can. We are partisan because everyone's partisan. We are biased because everyone is biased, but we try to be as fair as we possibly can, get our cards out on the table, and we love to analyze. That's why we call it the Analysts. We love to take a look at what campaigns are doing right. We love to take a look at what campaigns are doing wrong, and we like to make suggestions either way. But I need to call a timeout for the opening monologue for this edition of The Analyst, because there's something everyone really needs to think about just for a second, because it feels like ever since the disastrous Joe Biden performance in the debate with Donald Trump, everyone has been trying to sort of be like a guest on my show, The Analyst, right? Have you noticed everyone's talking about how they should replace Joe Biden, who should be the replacement, what works, what doesn't work, and all of that is interesting. I know that's interesting to talk about, and we will talk about it. And how can you stop not talking about it? It's certainly an intriguing process and an intriguing question. But I have to call time out on all of that, even on this program, because I need to reiterate something in case you have forgotten what the situation is here. We're all Americans. We're all human beings. We all live on this earth. And I'm going to say this as plainly as I can. The president of the United States is senile. That's not a scandal. That's an emergency. Now, yes, there are elements of scandal in this that we can talk about. Absolutely. Yes, there are elements of politics and strategy that we can talk about because of this. Absolutely. But first and foremost, the leader of the free world, the person who has the final say on whether we destroy this world or not with nuclear weapons, the person who decides so much of the fate of this country and many others, is not cognitively able to do his job. And this is now the consensus in the United States, Republican, Democrat, Independent, even the news media. This is the consensus opinion, and I believe it's true, especially for those of us who've noticed this decline precipitously since 2019. I believe it's true. This is the consensus in America. Again, the president of the United States is senile. We are in an emergency situation in this country. I don't care about the presidential nomination process just for a second. I don't care about this election just for a second. The first thing we must talk about is how safe is the United States with a president who is not cognitively able to do his job? How are our enemies thinking about taking advantage of this? And what do we need to do to protect ourselves right away? And I think the answers to that are very simple. Whether the person that they're going to choose to try to replace the president of the United States in the election is the same as the vice president. The fact is, we have a constitutional process to follow when the president is mentally incapacitated. That is the 25th Amendment, when the cabinet can decide to oust the president if the president himself doesn't want to step down. I don't think it would come to that. I think that if the cabinet really just spoke to Joe Biden and a few other people spoke to Joe Biden, it wouldn't be something that the cabinet would have to vote on, and they would have to legally, and I guess use the Secret Service to remove him from the Oval Office. I don't think it would come to that. I think that if 10, 11 members of the cabinet came and spoke together and stood together, Joe Biden would realize he would step down. And whatever we think of Kamala Harris, constitutionally, she should be the president at this point. I certainly, again, my bias is on the table. I'm certainly not going to vote for her. She's the candidate in November, and no one has to vote for her. And they can have a different candidate, by the way. The Democrats are in no way obligated to nominate her for president if that's, if you object so much to that. But we do have a constitutional process for that. The founding fathers, all these years ago, saw this as important to have a successor to the president. And then many years later, with the 25th Amendment, the good legal minds in this country also knew that there had to be some kind of process after what happened to President Wilson when he had his famous stroke in 1919, after what happened in the sudden death of FDR, which in retrospect sounds like, oh, that wasn't such a shock. We knew how sick he was. The rest of the country actually didn't, at the time, actually didn't know how sick he was. So my point is, the founding fathers had a process setting up an items of succession. Vice president, speaker of the House, et cetera, et cetera. That was very wise of them. And then the folks who put together the 25th Amendment were even wiser in putting together a process to remove a president who is incapacitated in either a major way or in enough of a way that he can't or she can't do the job. Again, before we get into all the analysis, before we get into the strategies, We must realize the situation we're in, and we should be grateful that we have a process to get us out of that. We cannot have another day with Joe Biden as president of the United States. Do I think he will be president for another day? Yes, sadly, but we can't have that. He should not be president for another day. And if that means Kamala Harris is president for 4 months, folks, as distasteful as that is to you, understand, all jokes aside, you can't have a senile person as president of the United States. Our national security is more important than that. Do I think that Kamala Harris will make all the right decisions? No. Do I even think she'll make the majority right decisions? Absolutely not. But do I prefer her in her cognitive state to someone who is not in a cognitive state, who is either going to make terrible decisions or will have people who are completely unelected and unaccounted for making the decisions for him? The answer is yes. I would rather have Kamala Harris because I believe in the wisdom of our founding fathers who said that the vice president should succeed a president when that president can no longer serve. And I believe in the wisdom of the people who put together the 25th Amendment. And that's just the way it is, folks. And before we talk about all the strategy and all the analysis and who they should replace Biden with and what's going to happen with the polls, all that's very interesting. I get that. But folks, again, I'm going to say it one last time before I wrap up this monologue. The president of the United States is senile. That is not a scandal. That is an emergency. Okay, when we come back, we're going to be joined by someone who knows a lot about emergencies. She's a crisis communications expert, along with a lot of other kinds of communications that she's an expert on. Monique Tapie, she is a managing partner at Shadwell Partners, and she's going to talk to us about all this kind of stuff. How do you deal with crisis communications, with crisis situations when you're in that kind of a position? So stay with us. We'll be right back with Monique Tapie.
If you are looking for the best free entertainment experience, look no further than Avo TV. Catch all the hottest TV shows, music videos, Nollywood movies, and comedy, all in one place. Avo TV lets you watch what you want, when you want, on all your favorite devices, completely free. Download the Avo TV app from your Google Play Store or Apple App Store today.
Hi, I'm Jake Novak, and welcome back to this edition of The Analysts with Jake Novak. Very, very special guest, good friend of mine for many, many years, someone I really respect when it comes to communications and strategy. It's Monique Tapie. She is the managing director of Shadwell Global Partners. And when I say she knows something about crisis communications, let me just say, this is someone who used to do communications for Philip Morris. This is someone who does a lot of lobbying on Capitol Hill. And this is someone, by the way, that if you are an individual corporation, a nonprofit group, an organization, you want to talk to Monique and the folks at Shadwell because they do excellent, excellent work advocating for some of the best causes out there and some of the best businesses out there. But Monique, we got to talk about the bad stuff right now. I just explained it. We're in a crisis situation in America right now, not just because it's a campaign, but because the president of the United States is basically consensus opinion is that he's incapacitated. Tell me a little bit about do you have any kind of special rules that you look at when you think of when someone is in a crisis situation, when a company or an individual? Is there something that you look at first before you offer any advice?
So the first thing that you do is, situational analysis. And, comms 101, especially when it comes to crisis communications, one of the most important things is to be honest with people. People are not stupid. They don't like being treated as though they are. So for me, this is a really tough situation because this isn't a corporation that has made a mistake. This isn't BP Deepwater Horizon that we use as an example of poor crisis communications. First thing that you have to do is you have to own the situation. And then you go from there by telling the truth and saying, listen, in this situation, I have a lot of experience, unfortunately, with dementia and Alzheimer's. And there is a look that nearly every person I've ever seen, and I went through it with my father, his twin, and now my mother, there's a certain vacant look that they get. So it's hard for them to come back from this because so many people know someone that has suffered from this. And it really garners pity for me, and it makes me feel really bad. And I look at it more as elder abuse. But someone really needs to step up to the plate. You're seeing right now so much divisiveness, even within the Democratic Party. And for me, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or if you're a Republican. At this point, they need to come out and explain solutions. What are the activities that we're going to be doing to fix this? How do we ensure this? Because this is not about one individual. This is about the United States of America. It is about national security. Who is really making the decisions? And they need to come out and be really honest about it. And that's for any crisis communications, is you have to be honest, because once you tell people how you're going to fix something, even if you say to them, listen, we made a mistake and we're going to work now, and this is what we're going to do, A, B, C, to fix these errors so that everybody can move forward, but we need you to work with us to be able to do that. First thing you're going to garner through that honesty is respect. And that is the most important thing. And if you're not doing that, you're losing the faith of the people. And that's what we're seeing right now.
You know, Monique, I think we can agree, not only, listen, we're not doctors, but you've had this experience with it. And I think that the first thing we need to agree with is that this is no longer really a salvageable situation for Joe Biden and the crisis communications. This is really a crisis communications exercise for the Democratic Party, for the administration, the wider administration. So, you know, as you well know, because we talked about this before, my favorite crisis communications and crisis action event in history was what Tylenol did after the cyanide incident in 1982. It was probably only a couple of stores in a part of Illinois that were affected by that poisoner, who, by the way, completely still a cold case. Don't know who did it, but people died. But Tylenol not only took responsibility, but they literally pulled every bottle and jar of Tylenol off of every shelf in the entire world. And that proved to the world public that they were serious about this. So I think that if I have to do an analogy, I think one of the things the Democratic Party has to do to prove that they care about America and they care about the office of the presidency is they must remove Joe Biden from office. They must do that first, and then they can start talking about how they deal with the rest of the crisis, as far as whether, again, I mean, they have to follow the Constitution. Whether you love or hate Kamala Harris, the founding fathers, I think, were right to set up a vice president just for this purpose, among other things, but clearly the most important purpose. So, I mean, do you think that that's really the way they should look at it, and just kind of pulling him off the shelf?
Well, I think that you have to take the steps of, you can't just pull someone. I wish it would be that simple. It's a time-consuming process. You know, I think that the first thing that they should do, and I was listening to the news today, and even one of the governors had said maybe he should put himself for a cognitive test. And if he did that, then if he passes, which I doubt, just because of my experience with dementia and what I've been watching, a deterioration over the last couple of years, if he does that, and say he even passes that, or if he fails that, then the question comes in, okay, how do we fix this? How long does it take to put the 25th Amendment into place? But there needs to be comms going on in the background for that right now. And then if you look at the Trump campaign, they need to be talking about how long has this been going on? And they need to do so with respect and without the insults that we see flying around, because it's a very sensitive issue. So many people know so many others that had suffered from this. And I would speak to who has known this, for how long have they known this, if I'm on the other side. And I'd want to lay out who's been making the decisions. And I'd want to start talking about that now, because now you have a distrust, even from Democrats and independents, as we're all seeing in the news. And they need to be proactively talking about what is the solution to this. And they need to be sensitive and caring about it, because regardless of whether you like Biden, you like Trump, it's still a human being.
Yeah, I know you're a little pressed for time, so let me ask this as a final question. Let me talk a little bit more about the Trump campaign, because do you think, I have a feeling that during these first couple of weeks, it's actually been very smart. And this is true of all crisis communications, I think, that when you have a competitor, and they're going through this terrible problem, you stay quiet for as long as possible. But at some point, you should make a statement. And I think that maybe have we reached that point now where the Trump campaign should make a statement, and formally, not just off, someone on a hidden camera. I mean, should they formally make something? You kind of alluded to what they should say, but when do you think that point happened, and are we there yet?
I think that point happened the day after the debate, quite frankly.
Oh, really?
Yes, I do. And I think that they could have or should do it now in saying, we're not putting our competitor down or, the other candidate down. This is just a serious concern. It is a health concern. And when you're talking about that, it's also who is, and we've heard it a million times throughout all the media, who is calling the shots? Because when you're looking at it, for me, I'm sitting there going, the American people elected an individual as president. Of course, those that work in politics know that it comes with a full array of other people behind him. But if someone's not coherent enough to make that decision, then who is making the decisions for America? And for me, I look at it, as I said earlier, it's elder abuse on him and putting him out there in the front. It's not fair to him. It's not fair to the American people. And that is the statement that I would come out and make. And I would have came out with it probably a little while ago, because there were already rumors months ago that I know you heard, that I heard, that he was not going to make it all the way through his campaign. And I think that the talking about that should have happened a little while ago. But after seeing what we saw at the debate, that was time for a statement. Jake, one of my best friends, her mom passed away also from Alzheimer's. She could not watch the whole debate because it made her cry that this person, for her, was being abused by being even placed there, if that makes sense. But I think this time for a statement has passed, and it should be one of compassion, and it should be one that outlines the importance, because this is not a corporate entity. Corporate entity, you're talking about your competitor. This is the president of the United States, and it's the most powerful position in the world. And there's a certain responsibility that we all have, whether we are Democrats, independents, or Republicans, to our country first, regardless of party.
Yeah, and this reminds me a little bit of my years in financial news. And it happens to be that one of my closest friends from high school, really my best friend in high school, who's almost a billionaire, has made a tremendous amount of money. And it's kind of known how he did it. He basically calls everyone on their BS. He's the guy when they're having the stock, the earnings report day, when the company gets on the phone and the analysts get on there and they say, I love this management team, they're fantastic. And he's the one who interrupts on the phone and says, okay, name 3 managers and what they do. The people who are saying that, I always had I said this during 2020, I say it now too. There's no such thing as a Joe Biden voter. There was just an anti-Trump voter. And they did put this scarecrow in there to be their candidate. And one of the things that I think right now is I just demand to people, what is it about Joe Biden that you like, other than he has different DNA from Donald Trump? And this is where we are now, because now you can't even say the guy is competent. You can't even say that. And, yes, there's certainly some sympathy we feel for Joe Biden. But remember, this is someone who has a record of not being honest. This is a record of someone who has absolutely enriched himself in office. His family has decided to make this sacrifice. I hope he gets good care. Absolutely. I don't think he should have a painful and terrible death. That's not what I'm hoping for at all. But this is a real attack on the American public. Monique, thank you so much for joining us. Shadwell Global Partners, just an amazing place. And we know that you're doing all this kind of great work. You're an expert on crisis communications. And here's my hope for you, that everyone who comes to you, even when they have a bad problem, it's not as bad as this, because I see nobody out of this one.
Well, you know what it is too, Jake, just to wrap it up. And I tell folks all the time, don't vote for personality, vote for policy. Take the time and look. I've voted on both sides of the aisle. I've voted independent throughout my lifetime. And it's about the policy. And you and I have talked about this. We don't know these folks personally. We really don't. We see what the media wants us to see. And you really need to just peel back, the orange or onion, whichever way you want to look at it, and just take a look at the policy and what do you think is best for this country and for your families.
Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you,
Monique
Jake.
Tapie again, Shadwell Global Partners. She is a managing director, and I want to Hi, welcome back to The Analysts with Jake Novak. And we have some pretty heavy topics to start this edition this week. Obviously, my opening monologue talking about the emergency situation the country is in right now. And then we talk crisis communications with Monique Tapie. But let's get back to some of the bread and butter of what The Analyst does, where we talk about strategy, we talk about communications, we talk about the regular stuff, not the emergency stuff all the time. And of course, what better way to describe what's going on with the Trump campaign? Still, Donald Trump is still not named his choice. Again, it's kind of his preference, because where, of course, the Republican delegates will certainly vote for the person that Donald Trump chooses. I can't believe there would be a revolt of the delegates on a matter such as that. But just to be technically correct here, he will make his nominee choice, and then, of course, the delegates will decide. And he still hasn't chosen that person. And I want to talk about this entire process with Jason Epstein. He's the president of South 5 Strategies. This is a boutique communications firm. They do a lot of political communications. Definitely someone who talks about issues and things like that. A really good person to go to. We talked to Monique before, who kind of deals with nonprofits and corporations, sometimes political issues, but Jason deals with kind of the issues and going on here in the United States and overseas. But he certainly knows some of the things that are going to go into the choice for vice president. So first question I want to talk to Jason about is that, do you think the Trump campaign has made the right move or the wrong move by waiting so long? You know, he's been the presumptive nominee since even before the primary started. Do you think they've made the right move or the wrong move by waiting so long to make a choice?
Well, thanks for having me, Jake. And I would argue that the Trump campaign, if given the opportunity, would hold off until the day before the election. I mean, if it could. Right now, the Democrats are self-destructing, and we remember the Napoleon's quote about, when your enemy is making a mistake, don't get in the way. That said, I guess the word is that the choice will be made in Milwaukee at the last possible moment.
Yeah, and I don't think that that's a bad. I mean, I think it's a good idea. You know, you think it should be as late as possible, and I think that one of the reasons why it should be as late as possible is just look how much this campaign has changed in the last 3-4 weeks. 3-4 weeks ago, we were talking about the convictions of Donald Trump in the hush money trial, and would there be a sentencing, and would he not even be able to run? And now that seems like a million years ago. The sentencing has been postponed. There may not even be a sentencing now. All that has changed. And you can imagine, like, maybe you choose someone based on that, and now that's not even a major issue. I would say that now that, of course, the decision will be made before the end of the convention next week, I would say that maybe with all the issues that have come up in the last couple of weeks, the chances of someone younger being chosen have really risen. So in other words, a Doug Burgum, who is by no means an elderly gentleman, but is older than a Tim Scott, older than a Marco Rubio, older than a Glenn Youngkin, although barely. Maybe their stock has gone, maybe his stock has gone down a little bit. But again, clearly, if there was someone older that they were thinking about, I think that their stock has really, really dropped. But let's talk a little bit about this. First of all, I can't use this program to kind of change my earlier prediction. So I will get all my cards on the table that for more than a year, I have predicted that Donald Trump will pick Tim Scott. And gun to my head, I still think he will choose Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina to be his running mate. However, I will say this now, and then I'll let Jason tell me what his choice of who he thinks it's going to be and who he thinks the best choice would be. I do think that the best choice right now would be Marco Rubio, and let me say why. It's very rare that a vice presidential candidate can actually net you votes. It just doesn't work that way. But in this case, there is one state that I think could really decide this election, and that's Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a skyrocketing number of Latino voters who are uncommitted. Now, we've done an earlier edition of The Analyst. We spoke to an expert who didn't think that the Latino vote was winnable for the Republicans. And I don't think so either. I don't think they're going to get 50 or 51% or even 45% of the Latino vote. But if they get 40, if they get 38% of that vote, yeah, Trump's going to win. And I think that Rubio could bring some of those voters to the table. And a distant second to Rubio as far as the most effective, I would say, would be Governor Glenn Youngkin of Virginia, because Governor Glenn Youngkin potentially could help Trump win Virginia, although that would really, I think, still be a little bit of a stretch. But more importantly, Youngkin has a national issue that he can bring to a lot of the swing states in his fight against corrupt school boards, in his fight against having men in girls' locker rooms and things like that, which I think will play very well in Wisconsin, will play very well in places like Michigan and stuff like that. So again, can't move away from my prediction that it's going to be Tim Scott, but I would think that Marco Rubio would actually be the best choice. Where do you stand on this, Jason?
Well, look, I think that if you pick a World Series winner in March and they're in fourth place in September, look, maybe it's not going to quite pan out, and you have to reassess. But I think it's brave of you to stick with Tim Scott. I apologize. I don't see that happening. To me, Tim Scott did not really perform very well during the primaries, and even as a surrogate, I don't think came off as very impressive. I do hear what you're saying regarding some of the other candidates. I agree that Glenn Youngkin would be very impressive. There's the Commonwealth of Virginia is there for the taking. Youngkin is a governor, so has some executive experience, also a leader in private industry. Two traits that Trump would find impressive: experience, compatibility, whether there's an election benefit, and of course, I would say the wild card is not having skeletons in the closet. So Youngkin is definitely impressive, and I do agree about Marco Rubio for potentially picking up some Latino votes. You mentioned Pennsylvania, but I still lean in the direction of Doug Burgum because, again, compatibility ultimately is the number one issue. Loyalty could matter as well. And yes, vice presidents, as you said, don't really move the needle very much in terms of a state here, a state there. If it did matter, you could even argue for J.D. Vance, who, although Ohio is firmly in Trump's camp, neighboring states are there for the taking. Pennsylvania, Michigan, in particular. So I will probably lean toward Burgum just because compatibility, who are you going to sit with and have coffee, have lunch with for 4 years? And Doug Burgum checks those boxes. He's not a wow candidate, but as you have indicated, maybe that's not really needed at this time.
Right. My only thought about Doug Burgum is that he's coming from a very, thinly populated state in North Dakota. I think that there are going to be some people in the Republican Party who still are part of the Trump camp and still are establishment Republicans. There's not the biggest crossover there, but there is some who will say this reminds them of the Sarah Palin decision, coming from a really small populated state like Alaska, and that maybe they want to move otherwise. But there's no doubt. I mean, it does seem like that's just a very safe choice. But I think everyone we've talked about today is relatively a safe choice. I do have my concerns, even though I still think he's still the leader. Or if I had, again, a gun to my head, I have to say it. I think Tim Scott, disturbs me a little bit, worries me a little bit as far as skeletons in the closet are concerned. I know he's been a senator for some time. You think they would have vetted him completely. First of all, though, it's South Carolina. And it feels like everyone who comes out of that state is a skeleton in their closet that people don't know about that comes out of nowhere. And second of all, again, I'm not making any judgments, but he's just getting engaged and married now, which leads me to believe that there may be somebody who comes out of the woodwork and says something about this guy. That's one of the things I would worry about if I were on the Oppo research team, for the Trump campaign.
Sure.
But let's talk about, it's funny. I didn't spend enough time talking about J.D. Vance, and I want to talk about that just for 1 second, because I've said before, I've written about this many times, that a key moment in American history was when Ronald Reagan was convinced to wholeheartedly support George H.W. Bush to be his successor. And the argument that he made, Reagan himself, because I know some people who were in the room, was that George Bush was very loyal to him. And that's all well and good. But in retrospect, when you think about what's happened since, and when you think what's happened to the conservative movement in the country, it's clear to me and a lot of other people that Jack Kemp should have been the person that Ronald Reagan supported for many, many, many reasons. And I wonder if J.D. Vance is a more elegant and sophisticated version of what Trump is all about, bringing back these disaffected voters, bringing back these alienated voters. One of my pet peeves is when the political class talks about apathetic American voters, when they really are talking about alienated American voters, voters who know quite well why they're not voting or why they're not getting enthusiastic. And J.D. Vance is all about that with his understanding of the opioid epidemic and fentanyl in this country. And I wonder if there's some kind of argument at some point where they say, this guy actually has the ideological mantle that Trump, in an even more sophisticated way. And I wonder if, is there somebody else out there who also kind of follows in that Trump mode, really gets that MAGA understanding of the country? I don't know. I really, and none of these other people we mentioned really are like Trump in that way.
There's something to be said about that. The challenge with J.D. Vance, however, is, again, there's no real executive experience. His book made him famous, but he did not, he was not a leader of, he wasn't a chief executive, he's a senator. And while there are some interesting aspects of his background that would help down the road, not sure that that's part of the equation for Trump. I admit that there have been moments where I thought that J.D. Vance would be the clear favorite. But the more you think about what Trump wants and where he sees the country, yes, some of that works to Vance's benefit. But for example, this notion that Trump is this foreign policy, not isolationist, but let's say very cautious on foreign policy, I think that gets oversold sometimes. Trump is still very much about being engaged, and not sure where Vance fits in that scenario. So I wouldn't be surprised by a Vance selection, but hey, also, Marco Rubio looks younger than Vance, but Vance is 39, not even 40 years old. It's a bigger risk than I think some people are speculating.
One thing we didn't mention about the Marco Rubio scenario is that if Marco Rubio becomes the running mate and Trump wins, this now opens the door for Ron DeSantis to have a contiguous political career. He's term limited as governor of Florida. That sets him up to run for Senate, where he would not have to deal with term limits. There would have to be some logistical changes. I guess Rubio would have to officially register as being in Washington, D.C., which is easy to do because he obviously has a residence there in addition to Florida. I have no doubt they can get through those logistical problems, in addition to how DeSantis would fill his seat. Does he fill him with a surrogate until he's able to run? I mean, there's all kinds of machinations there, but DeSantis is so popular in Florida, I really do expect him to win that seat by hook or by crook. And probably not even needing either if Rubio steps away. Obviously, we've already gone through this process with Donald Trump, and he chose Mike Pence. And I just like to ask you about the differences between 2016 and 2024, because the way I see it, Mike Pence was chosen to help seal the deal with Republicans, not the country at large. Mike Pence, his value to the Trump campaign was completely done in his acceptance speech, when he referred to Donald Trump at least 5 times as this good man. And that was a real message he was sending to, especially to evangelicals, but other sort of squeaky clean Republican types, that they may not like the way this guy talks or looks, but he mentioned all these good deeds that he had done in New York and other places, and he kept referring to him as this good man. Well, here we are now in 2024. There's no need to sell Donald Trump to the Republican base anymore. That's not necessary. So it now has to be more of a national sale. And now you still feel that Doug Burgum is the best guy for the national sale, and just wondering if that's part of your calculus.
I mean, Dick Cheney came from that huge metropolis known as Wyoming, right? So
Yeah.
So each year we go through this, we learn something new. One could argue, if you've kind of made the case for Glenn Youngkin just now in that regard. The sweater vest, whatever you want to call it, appealing to suburbanites. One name we haven't mentioned yet, Ben Carson, if we want to talk African American, but perhaps someone with whom Trump has a longer relationship with, someone who is not going to outshine him, someone who isn't going to be running for president in 4 years. And as you said, there's no real, perhaps maybe reaching out to independents, to some Democrats. But as each day passes, there is the argument to be made that Trump just needs to find someone with whom he's simpatico.
Yeah.
We are approaching a moment, and perhaps it's wrong to think this way in July, but we can't help ourselves. We're less and less talking about can Trump eke out a victory, and more about what sort of mandate he may have going into 2025.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great launching point for another question, another angle I want to talk about. We have started to see in the last few days, not just talk about vice presidential running mates, but other people who may or may not be in a Trump cabinet. Now, one of the people who I would have liked, but never thought he was a serious contender, one of the people I would have liked to be a running mate for Donald Trump would be former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. For the simple reason that I think Mike Pompeo is probably the smartest guy who's been in any administration in a good 20, 30 years. He's very, very, very intelligent. Obviously, I agree with his policies, but he's really got the brains to go with it. Now, it's been pretty much reported that Pompeo has very much volunteered to be Secretary of State again under Donald Trump. And once the election is over, you can really argue Secretary of State is certainly a more important position than Vice President. But no sooner is that being talked about than some of the very far right people in the country have started to attack Mike Pompeo. They don't like him for a number of reasons. They don't like the fact that he was director of the CIA years ago. They'd come out against that. But I'm wondering if you had to get the band back together. Any other names from the first Trump? Again, assuming he's reelected, any other names from the first Trump administration that you would bring back? Because if it's me, I'd like to see Mike Pompeo and Steve Mnuchin come back. But after that, I really don't have any favorites. I wonder if you do.
I agree with you regarding Pompeo, although he may be a better fit to move across the river to the Pentagon. Then there's a question of whether O'Brien would return as national security advisor. If there are minimum 53 Republicans in the Senate, could Rick Grinnell snare Secretary of State? That could be very interesting. But you'd need at least 53 Rs to make that happen. And there are a number of other players in Trump world as well that would be on the cusp. Could they get Senate approval? But I'm with you on Pompeo. I just think that there may be a better fit for him in terms of the Pentagon as opposed to state. And I think that would, if he went over to the Pentagon, it might actually maybe smooth over some of those concerns that you raised.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, we've got a lot of suspense. I can't remember a more suspenseful time in American political history, at least in my lifetime. I assume during the election of 1860, we had something similar, but we have a situation where we may not have the same presidential nominee on the Democratic side in a week. We're certainly waiting for the vice presidential nominee, which in this election, I think is a little bit more consequential than others. And of course, we have a lot of other moving parts. We could have stuff that has nothing to do with the election, and we could have the removal of a president. Forget about removing a nominee and replacing the nominee. So Jason, thanks for all of your insights. Jason is the president of South 5 Strategies, a great firm to take a look at. You can find them on the internet. Anything else you want to tell us about South 5 that people should know?
I mean, I think you said it the way I wrote it out for you. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, Jay.
Thanks for joining us, Jason. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this. I mean, you can call it a special edition. I don't know how we get more special on this kind of a program, on a political program, looking at American politics. But again, as I urge everyone at the beginning of this edition of The Analysts, just remember the situation that we are in here. As much as we like to strategize, as much as we like to look at different scenarios, and we certainly did that during this edition of The Analyst, don't forget the current state of affairs in this country. We are all Americans. I know that we're all patriotic to one way or the other. At the very least, we're all human beings, and we are dealing with an emergency situation. We have a president of the United States, the consensus opinion, and I think it's informed, who is not cognitively able to do his job. That's not a scandal. That's not a strategy session. that's an emergency, and we should all think of it that way. Folks, thanks for joining me on this edition of The Analyst with Jake Novak. We'll be back real soon, and the world will look a lot different the next time you see The Analyst. Thanks again for joining us.